In this demo, we're going to cover two concepts in Photoshop. The first of which is filters, and the second of which are smart objects. Now, filters have been around with Photoshop for many, like decades. And there are many filters out there. Several of them, and I'm just going to do one that I think is awful, such as emboss. Several of them are terrible, right? They don't do anything that's going to be useful. And one of the issues with filters in Photoshop is that they have all been used so frequently by so many people that as soon as you see one, if you've ever used Photoshop before, you know exactly what somebody did to that image. And so I'm going to ask that you use filters judiciously when you're working in Photoshop. That said, there are some that are really useful. Some of the, and do not look fake or canned. Two sets of those are the blur and the blur gallery, and then another set is noise. And there's certain stylizing, not stylizing, sharpen can also be a very useful one. If you have an image that's a little blurry or a little unclear, you can use sharpen to clean that up a touch. It's sort of the opposite of blur. But then there's a ton of other stuff that just really looks awful. So you can experiment with the different filters. They're a lot of fun to play with. But we're really going to focus on how to use just a couple of these filters in this course. So the blur tools all work pretty much the same. They have several different options, but I'm going to just start with Gaussian blur. And Gaussian blur is one of the most frequently used because the formulas, the algorithms that do the blur make for something that doesn't have any weird artifacts. Like it does a nice even blur across the entire surface. So, right, I have preview set here, and the only slider I have available to me on this one is how much blur I want. And you'll notice that it blurs the entire image uniformly. I'm going to cancel that. Don't even need to apply it. There's other blurs that have a couple more options. Right? There's the surface blur, which I can increase the radius, I can pull up the threshold, and you can see that that does something totally different. Right? But it does soften these solid colors, it smooths them a little bit. Right? And it smooths some of these rough edges as well. Right? So there's several blurs. If you need to know what one does, it's very easy to go online and just do a search for Photoshop surface blur, and there will be plenty of information about how to use it both on Adobe's site and elsewhere on the internet. And that goes for any filter that we've got. Okay, so let's look at the blur gallery. I'm going to start by clicking on field blur. All of these, as you notice, field blur, iris blur, tilt shift, path blur, and spin blur are all available over here. And the blur gallery allows us to not blur the whole image uniformly, but it allows us to say, I want this part to be in focus, and I want this other part to be blurred, and it allows you to say how much blur you want in each area. It's basic. And by default, you have this one point, and it works like a Gaussian blur at this point, right? I can just increase or decrease the amount of blur by sliding this slider here, or the slider here, or enter the value in this box that I want. But what it also allows me to do is drop several of these pins. So I'm going to drop another one over here, and maybe I'll drop a third one up here in the corner. Right? So let's say I want this part of my image to actually be in focus. So I'm going to pull this down until it gets to 0. And then because this is actually closer to the object, now you'll notice as I move this closer to the other point, that seam gets tighter and tighter between what's in focus and what's out of focus. And so let's say I want this part actually to be blurred to about 3 or 4, right? These things are close to this, but they're a little bit behind it. So if I had a really shallow depth of field, which is when you have something in focus and everything else is blurred, versus a large depth of field, or a deep depth of field, which is when everything in your entire image is in focus. Even if you have mountains that are 5 miles away behind you, they're in sharp focus. That would be something with a a large depth of field. Right, so this allows me to say, I want to focus on this point, I want the background to be really blurred, and I'd like this to be less blurred. Now I can add as many points as I want to, but I'm going to leave it with these three here. Now if I go ahead and click this up arrow, the points will disappear, but the blur still stays there. And I can actually uncheck or check the blur to have this in. So I can actually have all of these if I wanted to. I don't know why I would need to, but I could have every single one of these blurs activated at the same time. Sometimes it's useful to have two, but I can't imagine having all five of them. All right, so the iris blur works similarly. You can always drop new points, but what it does is it takes this center point as the focal point and then allows you to blur the remainder of the image. These circles determine how quickly it fades from being in focus to being out of focus. This square here allows you to pull these corners into harder corners. They never go completely hard. And then these circles allow you to elongate this in either dimension and also rotate it. And there's no need for you to just have one blur. And oh yeah, and this blur, right, determines how blurred the background is. Right? There's no need to have just one blur point, right? I could come in here and say, oh, actually, right, these two things, maybe these 2 points here, and I'm going to pull this down again, real quick. Right? So maybe this point and this point are in focus, but everything else is out of focus in the image. And even here, I might need to make this even smaller, right? Because I don't want that background there to be in focus. Okay, so now, right, I have these 2 points that are in focus in my image. And I'm going to uncheck that, and again, close this up, and those will disappear. Tilt shift, if you've never seen tilt shift photography or are unfamiliar with it, just do a search online. It's a technique that makes actual scenes and actual cityscapes and things look like they're photographs of models. It's really kind of crazy. It was huge on the internet a few years ago. The way this blur filter works is that it allows you to have this one band of space that's in focus, and then you can expand or contract, you can expand or contract how much of your image is in focus. And you can also adjust these dashed lines to say how quickly it goes from being in focus to being blurred as much as you've requested it be blurred. Right? And so you can make really crazy things happen with this if you want to. And so you can do both of these independently, and you can also hover over these little circles and rotate the image so that it's, so that maybe one part's in focus but everything else is out of focus. So the path blur, all right, if I turn this on, it essentially makes something look like it's sliding to the side, right? So it's getting blurrier as it goes. So I can adjust the angle of this, I can adjust the blurriness, and you'll see that it starts to really stretch it out linearly. I get this red arrow that starts to grow from the end, right? And so it's least blurry here in the middle, and then it stretches out to either side. And there's several options here. The speed, right, essentially says how much blurring is going to happen here. And what this path blur is meant to do is it's meant to simulate motion, right? So if you have something moving very quickly through a photograph, it's going to blur. And you'll notice down here there's some motion effects you can add. So I can actually crank up the strobe strength. And what that does is it gives the effect that somebody is using a stroboscopic flash, right? So the flash isn't flashing once, it's flashing several times. And so now I get these harder edges. And you can say, oh, I've got 4 strobe flashes, or maybe I have 18, which seems ridiculous, right? Or maybe I have 2 strobe flashes. So then I get this overlapping thing, and maybe the strobe strength's a little bit softer, right? You can also actually add noise, and you can make it look like you're adding film grain. This actually works better than adding noise with the noise filters, right? So you can actually change the size, the roughness, the color of the noise. It has no color right now, but as I crank it up, it gets a little bit more colorful. We can reduce the highlights as well. There's lots of things you can change, right? If we make the grain really grainy, clearly that looks crazy, right? But again, this is something that really helps with what you're doing. Okay, so the other thing you can do with this that's important is you can taper the amount of motion as it moves. You can say, I want the blur to be centered, or I want it to be at the end. So here it's at the end of the arrow is where the blur is. If I check mark this, it's centered on the line. If I click Edit Blur Shapes, you can see that I actually get these two red arrows, and I can actually bend this, which, you know, I don't think you actually want to do this unless you're trying to create some other effect. But I can make this angle so it looks almost like it's moving at an angle through the thing. I can also, right, adjust this. I could actually pull this out so it really does some crazy things which would never actually happen. All right, I can make this blur on this side longer or shorter. And then there's the subject of these three little dots, right? The little white dots. These allow you to, at these points, it allows you to move the entire arrow, the bigger ones. These smaller ones allow you to create bends, right? So I can actually make this whole thing sweep around. Right, so it looks like it doesn't look like it's spinning at all because I've gone way too far with this. But right, you don't have to have a straight line as your definition. And you don't just have to have one, right? I can actually create multiples, and I can make this do whatever I want it to do, right? So pretty quickly, I've got something really crazy happening here. But this is what the path blur allows you to do. So I'm going to uncheck that. And then the spin blur is pretty simple. All it does is make something look like it's spinning, right? It starts to rotate the image in the blur area. And so as you stretch it out, right, you get this spinning blur. Nothing too crazy here. But depending on what you're doing, if you're trying to get the sense of motion in an image and it's a spinning motion, the spin blur might be a really great way to do that. Okay, so this is all fine and good. I actually was really happy with the path blur looking like it does. I don't know why. So I'm going to turn the path blur on. And this is the one that I want. Now, in order to set this, I need to come up here and hit OK. There's also a reset button, and there's a cancel button as well. So I'm going to hit OK. And I've done this. Now, here's the issue with doing this the way we've done it. Once you blur a layer, it is permanently changed, right? I can undo it right now. I can go back and step back and undo the last step. But I can't go in and change where it's blurred or how much it's blurred. It's set the way it is, and that causes problems, right? It's called destructive editing in the sense that I can't do anything with this image ever again. And what I'd really like to do is to be able to go back in and modify those blur points. Maybe I need to change the line a little bit. Maybe when I get other images on there, things aren't working out quite like I'd like to, and I really want to be able to change that. So what I need to do first is I'm going to undo this. And the way we get around this is with smart objects. And so what we're going to do is, let's go ahead and just save our image as it is. If you haven't saved it already, maybe you should change it to 3D model demo or something like that so you have your original image as well. And I'm not going to put this in temporary items. I'm going to put it here. Okay, so I've got my 3D model demo.psd. And depending on how you brought this in, when you create a new object, or when you create a new file, it may automatically size it to the same size as this image. To make sure that it does that, you can hit Command or Control A to select all, and then just hit Command or Control C to copy. And we're not actually going to be pasting this image into the new file, but when we do that, Photoshop automatically sets up the new dialog to the document type being clipboard. And the clipboard is where, when you hit copy, it copies the image to the clipboard. And so these are the number of pixels that this image is. It's 800 by 500. So I'm just going to hit OK. It's going to create a new one, right? I'm zoomed into 200%, so it makes sense that it's much smaller on here. And instead of pasting that image in there, I'm actually going to open the 3D model demo.psd file as a smart object. And so I'm going to go up to File. I'm going to go to Open as Smart Object. I'm going to find I'm going to stretch this out a little bit. I'm going to find, here we go, 3D model demo.psd. I'm going to open this. And when I do this, I get this special type of layer. All right, so it says 3D model demo, and I have this little file, this little paper icon here. That means that this is a smart object, and now it's telling me it's a smart object thumbnail. Right? So what a smart object is essentially it's an external file. And this is important because when you're working in Photoshop and you have smart objects, you want to have those other files nearby in the same folder, right? And so now I've got this smart object, and I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. I'm going to make sure I have the smart object selected. I'm going to go to Filter. I'm going to go down to Blur Gallery. Don't click on the first Blur Gallery option. This sets whatever you did last. It automatically applies it. So it doesn't open up the window. It just applies the spin or whatever filter I put on there. So I'm going to go to Blur Gallery, and I'll go to Field Blur. And now I'm just going to drop a few points. I'm going to have maybe one up here that's 15, one down here that's 15, and I'll make this one 0. And maybe I'll drop one over here that's 6 or something like that. All right? So it looks like, you know, because this isn't that much further back or this much further forward, you know, I'll have something there. Okay, so I'm happy. So now I'm going to hit OK. And you'll see that some pretty subtle, some changes have occurred, right? So suddenly I have this little thing down below my layer that says Smart Filters and then Blur Gallery, right? And so I can actually now turn on and off my filter, right? I can also go all the way down here and turn it off. And if I double click on the word Blur Gallery, it will open up the Blur Gallery, and I can actually come in here and modify my blur, right? So I can say, okay, I actually wanted that to be a little lower. Maybe this needs to be a little bit further away so that whole object's a little bit more in focus. I'm going to hit OK. And those changes will be updated, right? So now I have the ability to modify these, this image, I have the ability to modify my filters, which is great. Now, and the other thing is that this image stays the same, right? So if I decide that, oh, I don't actually want that blurred at all, I can turn it off. Now, there are certain things with a smart object you can't do. If I take the paintbrush and try and draw on top of a smart object, right? If I was to say maybe I want to use one of the burn or dodge tools, which burn darkens, dodge lightens color. So maybe I want to darken in some of these details here, make it a little bit more contrasty in certain areas. I can't do that with a smart object, right? I'm stuck. It says no. So if you have a smart object, if you've ever created one of these with this icon, and then you try and paint on top of it, it's not going to let you do much, right? There's other things. I can't use any of these tools. I can use selection tools, but really any of the brush tools are off limits. I'm going to deselect that area, by the way. Right, so any of the brush tools are off limits. I can move it, there's other things I can do, but there's certain stuff I can't do. Now, the reason why that is because this is an external file. However, the other nice thing about smart objects is you can continue to edit the smart object file, and those changes get updated in Photoshop. So, let's say I double click on this guy. When I do that, it's going to open the actual file, the 3D model demo.psd. You'll see that This file temporarily, because I haven't saved it, is named 3D demo as smart object-1. Right? I'll name it something eventually, but right now, so this is the actual file. So if I come in here, my actual file, let's say I'm going to add an adjustment layer. I'm going to add hue saturation. I'm going to pull this over here, right, so that this whole thing turns green. And so to start with, that's what I'm going to do, is I'm just going to add that hue saturation. And now I'm going to hit Command or Control S to save the file. And now if I go back to my blurred object over here, you'll see that it has already updated to the new colors that I set in this file. And so now that I have this open, I can come back over here. I could actually, let's say I do want to grab the burn tool, and I select layer 1 in the burn object, right? Because it's not going to work on any of the other layers. And then let's say, oh, I want to burn in, right, in here. I want that to be a little darker, those shadows in there. Maybe I want all the shadows just to be a little bit darker so this thing's more contrasty. All right, so now I can come in, I can edit this. Okay, let's say I'm happy with what I've done. I save it. And then those changes again are updated here. If I want to do something more dramatic, maybe I grab the paintbrush, just make a really, right, god-awful blue stroke. I actually used red, but because of the hue saturation, it's drawing it somewhere else. I'm not going to actually save that. I'm going to undo that. Because I could add a new layer, right? And then I could draw on that layer. So now I have 2 layers. I save this. I come back over here, and it's added that. Right? So smart objects allow us to take many of our filters. Not all filters will work with smart objects, but most will. And you get the smart filters. So you're able to make changes to those filters once you've applied them. And your image is protected, right? It doesn't, you're not going to like accidentally make some change to it that you can't later undo. Also, with the smart filters, notice that there is this white box, which means that it does have a mask. So I can come in here and only have, and actually, you know, have the blur effect happen in certain areas, but maybe I just come in here manually and sharpen certain parts of the image too, right? So again, I have the ability to, these smart filters give me far more options than just doing a standard filter on an image by itself.